Headlines that read, economy booms and American prosperity is back, are sort of the things you might expect from a Trump campaign video about what a second term might look like. But then there's this one. Industrial strength significantly increased, driven by the creation of a unified Reich. That would be a reference to the Third Reich, the official Nazi designation for Hitler's murderous genocidal regime. All of these headlines were part of a video that was reposted to the social media account of the Republican frontrunner. Now, the Trump campaign says the video came from a random account that a staffer reposted on Trump's Truth Social account and also his Instagram while Trump was in court yesterday. This is how the Biden campaign has responded. Parroting Mein Kampf while you warn of a bloodbath if you lose is the type of unhinged behavior you get from a guy who knows that democracy continues to reject his extreme vision of chaos, division, and violence. Joining me now is McKay Coppin, staff writer for The Atlantic and person who knows the Republican mind better than most. McKay, thank you for being here. And I just wonder if you can first of all, I should say that your colleague David Graham points out that there is a stock template that could be part of a plausible explanation for how these headlines made their way into that video. We have no reporting on that. We can't confirm that one way or another. But the fact of the matter is anti-Semitic Nazi language seems to be wending its way into conservative circles with more frequency here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that this instance is part of a larger, broader pattern of radicalization on the right.
Yeah, I think that's really well said because, this is part of a pattern, right? I think that people see stuff like this and it's easy to jump to the conclusion that, Trump is like a crypto Hitler fan. But I actually think what's happening is that it's something more nuanced, but actually maybe more alarming, which is that throughout Republican politics, and especially kind of the conservative movement at the activist level, the rising generation of conservative activists and people who are going into conservative media and Republican politics have been raised on a steady diet of, triggering the libs style politics, which is to say they parrot fascistic rhetoric, racist rhetoric in a kind of quasi-ironic way, but that is actually meant to gin up support among really unseemly people, and then also to, frighten people on the left, and they think it's funny, right? The problem is that the longer that people kind of live in that digital universe where they're pretending to be fascists or neo-Nazis or racists, the more the line between the performance and reality starts to blur. And you've seen this time and again with people who are found out to be, for example, producers on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show, or, writers, speech writers in the White House, Stephen Miller, for example. These people are people who have spent so much time, kind of trying to upset the left by parroting Nazi or fascistic rhetoric, that they've sort of started to adopt those views unironically. And I think that's why, just to make this point quickly, why repeatedly when Trump is caught or Trump's campaign is caught using fascistic rhetoric, or Trump is caught dining with a blatantly kind of anti-Semitic white nationalist like Nick Fuentes, the defense is always, oh, that was bad staff work, right? He had a bad advice from his staffers. The staffers didn't vet the social media post. They didn't vet the person who he's having dinner with. At some point, you have to ask, well, why is the staff so willing to make these mistakes over and over again?
Yeah, I thought immediately of your Stephen Miller piece, which suggests that he is so intent on owning the libs and melting the liberal snowflakes that he starts, embracing a sort of radical right vision that then comes to fruition once he's in the White House with a Muslim ban or a child separation policy that he wholeheartedly embraces, if not is, the actual architect of. I understand the Stephen Miller part of it, the sort of 2.0 radical right. I do wonder, though, how you think the Josh Hawleys and the Ted Cruzes, who are a little bit older, they're, Harvard trained, they're not coming from such a reactionary, like trolling the libs style, self-radicalization into Republican politics, how they fit into the context that you just laid out.
Well, so I think it's a great point, because I think Ted Cruz is a prime example of somebody who was raised in a Republican Party where being a young conservative meant being kind of like a young William F. Buckley, right? He was probably like, he was a nerd. He went to Harvard. He wore blazers and, with flag pins. He was like that kind of guy coming up through the Republican Party of Reagan and Bush. But, I mean, he's in the Senate now, and I can think of relatively few senators who are better at adopting that kind of lib-triggering, snowflake-melting, right-wing trolling attitude than Ted Cruz. And, would he approve of a campaign ad that uses Nazi rhetoric? Probably not, on the record, but is it possible that in private he's chuckling about it? I think that's possible. There's a generational thing that's happened where I think a lot of Republicans who are currently in office have had to adapt to this new ethos that Donald Trump has championed, and you see it at every level of the GOP at this point.
Well, yeah, and that would be my next question, which is, what of the Republican voters, right? I mean, Biden's making the argument that people are rejecting anti-democratic fascist ideology, but the fact, we all have seen these polls. This is going to be a very, very tight race between the man who is the figurehead of this movement, Donald Trump, and the man who stands in opposition to it, Joe Biden. Does that argument about fascism, does the shadow of the right, whether, intentional or unintentional, move voters in the Republican Party at this point? I mean, are they along for the ride with Trump and Stephen Miller? Is the roller coaster left has the train left the station?
I think certainly some of Trump's supporters are along for the ride, and they cheer stuff like this, or they think it's funny. I think a lot of Republican voters, the thing is, there's just negative partisanship is such a strong force in our politics at this point that a lot of Republican voters who wouldn't approve of stuff like this, or who would even be scandalized by it, when they live in their kind of algorithmically tailored, information bubble, they either don't come across this stuff, or if they do, it's always framed in a kind of what about fashion where the pivot is to look at this terrible thing Democrats are doing. And so I don't know if these sentiments are really widely held in the Republican Party, but I will say Joe Biden has staked his campaign on denormalizing Donald Trump and this type of rhetoric. And I think there's something admirable about it in some ways, defending democracy. I'm not sure if, as a campaign tactic, it's going to be successful, and I guess we'll find out in November.
And we'll find out what our country's all about after that.
Yeah.
McKay, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time and reporting on all of this. McKay Coppins with The Atlantic.
Thanks, Alex.